That bracelet didn't walk off on its own. Evelyn Bell said it the way women like her say everything, not loudly, but in a register that assumed the room would arrange itself around her meaning. She stood at the center of the Grand Meredith Hotel's main corridor, her ivory gown catching the chandelier light, one wrist bare where $2 million in diamonds had been resting 40 minutes earlier. Her other hand held a champagne flute she hadn't drunk from. She didn't need to drink. The evening was already intoxicating enough. The gala had been weeks in the planning. Senator Richard Bell's gubernatorial campaign had reserved the Grand Meredith's entire third floor for the event. 700 guests, 4 keynote donors, 3 network cameras, and 1 carefully orchestrated image of a man who protected families, because that was the message. That was always the message. The banquet tables were dressed in white linen that had come down from the suites that afternoon, laundered and pressed in the basement where Malcolm Hayes had spent the last 4 years of his life. Malcolm was standing in the service corridor when he heard his name. He had already handed over his badge. He had done it quietly, the way he did most things, without ceremony, without the kind of performance that would make a scene worse. Amara Chen, the hotel's operations manager, had asked him to step away from the gala floor, and he had stepped away. She had told him there was a discrepancy, and he had said he understood. She had told him the camera showed him as the last person to move a linen cart through the second-floor junction at 7:14, and he had said yes, that was his cart, that was his route. She had placed the laminate badge in a clear plastic sleeve, and he had watched her do it without reaching for it, without arguing, without any of the things people expected a man in his position to do. What he had done instead was wait. The corridor smelled of starch and the faint chemical sweetness of dry cleaning fluid. Malcolm had worked with that smell for so long it had stopped registering as a smell at all. It was just the texture of Tuesday evenings, of back hallways, of the particular silence that settles over a building when the public-facing portions of it are loud. He was 40 years old, and his hands were calloused from cart handles and loading equipment, and the particular physical labor that hotel management liked to call supervisory work when they were trying to avoid giving it a union classification. He had a daughter waiting upstairs near the front desk. He had told Lila to stay near the concierge station, and she had looked at him with her mother's eyes and said, "Okay, Daddy," and held her inhaler close. That was the thing about Evelyn Bell's declaration in the corridor. It wasn't that Malcolm hadn't known something was being arranged around him. He had felt the shape of it the moment Conrad Voss had appeared at the laundry intake 2 hours earlier, signing off on a cart exchange that Malcolm hadn't logged and hadn't requested. Conrad ran hotel security with the kind of quiet authority that came from being useful to the right people. He moved through the Grand Meredith like someone who knew where every camera pointed and how long each gap in coverage lasted. Malcolm had watched him initial the form and hadn't said anything, because you didn't say anything to Conrad Voss without a reason that would hold up. Now Amara was telling him to go home, and Evelyn Bell was telling the corridor that bracelets didn't walk. Malcolm reached for his jacket. He had left it folded over a chair in the break room, a small square room off the laundry corridor with a table and a coffee maker that had been broken for 6 weeks. His daughter's spare inhaler was in the inside pocket. He had meant to take it upstairs when his shift ended. He hadn't made it upstairs before the shift ended in the way that it had. He turned down the service stairs without looking back at Amara. He did not look back because he knew that if he did, he would see her relief, and that would be harder to carry than the humiliation. Lila was 11 years old, and she had her mother's eyes and her mother's habit of reading rooms before she read people. She had been sitting near the concierge station doing homework in a composition notebook when they had called Malcolm up from the basement. She had watched her father cross the lobby floor. She had watched Evelyn Bell's hand gesture toward him. She had watched 2 men in hotel blazers flank him, while Conrad Voss stood 6 feet back with his arms at his sides and the particular posture of a man who has arranged something and is now watching it execute. She had not moved from the concierge station. She had held her inhaler with both hands and breathed the way her father had taught her. Slow in, count 4, slow out, count 4, and she had watched. Malcolm found his jacket on the chair and felt the weight of the inhaler in the pocket, and then stood in the break room for a moment with the fluorescent light buzzing above him, He had promised Yvonne, in the last weeks before the pneumonia had taken her, that Lila would never watch him lose his dignity. He had said it the way people say things at bedsides, not as a resolution but as an accounting, a summation of what mattered. Yvonne had touched his face and said, "She already knew that, baby. She already knew." And he had taken the night shifts at the Grand Meredith, because the night shift came with better insurance, and Lila's asthma required the kind of medication that without insurance cost more per month than his rent. He reached into the jacket pocket for the inhaler. His hand found it. He stood there. From somewhere in the basement, from the far end of the laundry corridor, past the sorting bays and the industrial dryers and the cart storage, there came a sound. It was faint. It was rhythmic. It was not the sound of a machine. Malcolm turned. The laundry corridor at this hour was dim. The overhead strips ran at half power after 7 because the main wash cycles were done and only the finishing work remained, and the finishing crew had been reassigned upstairs to handle linen turnover for the gala. The corridor was 40 feet long and smelled of warm cotton and the residual heat of the dryers. At the far end, 7 carts stood in a line against the wall, 4 of them tagged with room numbers, 2 of them tagged for the morning cycle, and 1 of them untagged. Malcolm walked toward the sound. He knew every cart in this corridor. He knew their wheel calibration and their weight tolerances, and the particular sound each one made when it was pushed over the seam in the floor near the drain. The untagged cart was not one of his. It was a different cart from a different department, and it was sitting at the wrong end of the corridor, and it was the source of the sound. The sound was Morse code. Not well-executed Morse code, not the crisp rhythm of someone trained in it, but the desperate approximation of someone who had heard of it and was trying it because they had no other option. 3 short, 3 long, 3 short, pause, repeat. Malcolm stood in front of the cart. He had learned Morse code in a military hospital in Germany 19 years ago when he'd had 4 weeks of recovery time and a bunkmate who'd taught him out of boredom. He had used it exactly once since then, sending a joke message to Lila across the dinner table that she'd thought was hilarious until she figured out what it said. He looked at the cart. He looked at the corridor behind him. He looked at the cart again. He lifted the soiled linen from the top. The girl inside was 16, maybe 17, with dark hair matted against her Forden tape, across her mouth and her wrists bound with the kind of zip tie that came in security supply kits. She was wearing a pale blue dress that had been a nice dress several hours ago. Her eyes, when they met Malcolm's, were the eyes of someone who had stopped expecting rescue and was now confronted with the fact that it had arrived anyway. He pulled the tape from her mouth carefully, 2 fingers anchoring the edge against her cheek before he pulled, the way he'd been taught. The way you did it when someone was already in enough pain, she gasped. She breathed. She looked at him. "If they take me out the service door," she said, "my father wins tonight." Her name was Paige Bell. Malcolm cut the zip ties with a small utility knife he kept clipped to his belt for breaking down cardboard. He helped her sit up. She was trembling, from cold, from fear, from the particular physical aftermath of having been folded into a cart, and her breathing was wrong, tight and high in her chest. "Are you hurt?" he asked. "I'm allergic to something in the linen." The fragrance. She pressed the back of her wrist to her nose. The gala tablecloths. They use a different product for events. Malcolm had known that. He had flagged it in a supply memo 8 months ago. The event-grade linen spray contained a compound that several staff members had also reacted to. The memo had gone to Amara's office and had not come back. He looked at the zip ties on the floor. He looked at the tape. He looked at the cart tag, which was blank. "Who put you in here?" he said. "Conrad." He didn't say anything to that. He was already doing the calculation. What was behind him, what was ahead, what he had and what he didn't. He had his utility knife, his phone with 42% battery, his badge that had been taken from him 20 minutes ago, and Lila's spare inhaler. He also had 11 years of knowing every utility route in this building. "Can you walk?" he said. "Yes." "Then come with me. Don't use the elevator." Paige climbed out of the cart and stood on the corridor floor in her blue dress and her ruined evening shoes and looked at him with the expression of someone recalibrating. "You're the one, they said, stole my stepmother's bracelet," she said. "Yes, did you?" "No." She looked at him for one more second. Then she nodded and followed him down the corridor. Upstairs, Lila was still at the concierge station. She was not doing homework anymore. She was watching the lobby with her composition notebook on her knees and her phone in her hand, and she had been watching for 12 minutes, since her father had gone to the basement and not come back up the service stairs. She was watching the security desk. Conrad Voss had been at the security desk for the last 4 of those 12 minutes. He was not watching the lobby. He was watching a tablet, and his jaw was tight, and every 30 seconds he looked toward the service corridor door. Lila wrote something in her notebook. She wrote, "Camera cycle, service hall, 90-sec gap every 6 min." She had noticed this 8 months ago, when she'd been doing homework down here, on a slow Tuesday, and had watched the monitors flip through their rotation. She had thought it was interesting the way 11-year-olds find patterns interesting, as something to catalog and keep. She had not known until tonight why it mattered. She wrote, "Cart switch." She had watched the cart exchange happen at 5:40 from the window in the break room where she'd been eating a granola bar. A different cart had come through the junction. She had not seen who pushed it. She wrote, "Fragrance memo." Her father had told her about the memo, not because it was important, but because he told her about his work the way he told her about everything, as a kind of ongoing lesson in how systems operated and where they failed. She looked at the service corridor door. She picked up her phone and sent her father a text. It said, "I'm coming down." He texted back in under 10 seconds. "Stay. Watch Conrad. Tell me what he does." She put her phone on her knee and watched Conrad Voss. Malcolm had taken Paige through the dry cleaning annex, which connected to the kitchen loading area by a pass-through that was used for equipment transfers, and was almost never staffed after 8. The kitchen was active. The gala dinner service was ongoing above them, but the loading area was quiet, lit by a single yellow safety lamp over the exterior door. Paige told him about the USB drive while they moved. She had found the records 8 weeks ago, she said, in a file on her father's personal tablet that he'd left open when he went to take a call. A foundation called the Children's Future Trust had been receiving donations routed through 3 different campaign-adjacent organizations. The money went in as charitable giving and came back out as operating expenses. She had photographed 16 screens worth of documentation. She had taken the photographs and transferred them to a USB drive, and she had been trying to reach a specific journalist for 6 days. Tonight was the handoff, she said. She was going to be at the gala. Conrad saw me in the hallway. "How long have you had the drive?" Paige touched her dress. The neckline had a small hidden pocket, the kind that better dresses sometimes had, the kind that existed because women had been hiding things in their clothing for centuries. She pressed 2 fingers to it. "Still here," she said. "Your stepmother's bracelet," Malcolm said. "Conrad used it." "To do what?" "To move the cameras, or more specifically, to give someone a reason to check the cameras, which meant someone looking at footage, which meant everyone paying attention to the footage during the window when the cart exchange happened." Paige was quiet for a moment. "He set you up. He needed the cameras watched and he needed a reason. Your stepmother's bracelet was the reason." Malcolm stopped at the corner where the loading area met the flower staging room. He listened. Nothing. "The bracelet is probably in a dry ice container somewhere in this building, cold enough to beat the metal scanner. He'll retrieve it after tonight." "How do you know that?" "Because if he'd taken it out of the building, there'd be a record, and Conrad doesn't leave records he doesn't control." Paige looked at him with a different kind of attention now. "Who are you?" she said. "I'm the laundry supervisor," Malcolm said. "Come on." They had been moving for 11 minutes when Malcolm's phone buzzed. "Lila. Conrad just called someone." Looked at service door again. Then went through it. Malcolm stopped. The flower staging room was a refrigerated space off the kitchen corridor used for event floral arrangements. It smelled of roses and cold water and the green-cut smell of fresh stems. Shelves of white arrangements stood along the walls, the gala's centerpieces, already assembled, waiting for placement. The room was dim and cold, and they were standing between 2 rows of hydrangeas when Malcolm's phone buzzed again. "Lila, he's on the stairs." Coming down, Malcolm looked at Paige. Paige looked at the door. "Can you climb?" he said. She looked at her shoes. She pulled them off, held them in one hand, and looked at him in her bare feet on the cold floor. "What do we need to climb?" she said. The linen chute access was on the east wall of the staging room, behind a cabinet that stored floral wire and ribbon. Malcolm moved the cabinet, found the access panel, and confirmed what he already knew. It ran from the third floor to the basement and was wide enough for equipment drops. Not designed for people. Also not locked. He sent Lila a second text. Meet us at the kitchen service exit. South side. Don't let Conrad see you. 3 dots appeared. Then, okay. The chute smelled of old fabric and warm air and the faint scent of the dryer sheets that went into every cycle. Malcolm went first, bracing his shoulders and working his way down by degrees, and Paige followed with her shoes in her hand and her blue dress gathering at the top of the passage. She was quieter than he expected. She did not panic, which told him something about her. He had been thinking about what it told him about her for the last 20 minutes. They came out in the lower basement, a level below the laundry corridor, where the building's utility infrastructure lived. Pipes, conduit, the HVAC junction that served the event floors. It was warmer here and louder, the ambient machinery filling the space with a constant low hum. Malcolm's phone buzzed. Lila. South exit. Where are you? He typed. 2 minutes. Then from above them, from the floor of the laundry corridor directly overhead, they heard footsteps. Paige went still. The footsteps moved. They crossed the laundry corridor at a pace that was not searching, that was checking. The particular rhythm of someone who had a route and was confirming whether something was where it was supposed to be. Then the footsteps stopped. The cart. Conrad had gone to the cart and found it empty. Malcolm put his hand on Paige's shoulder and moved. They came up through the utility stair, a concrete shaft used for maintenance access, not on the building's standard emergency plan, not on the routes Conrad Voss would have prioritized, and emerged in a storage corridor 1 level below the kitchen. 50 feet from the south exit, Lila was standing at the exit door. She was 11 years old, and she was holding her spare inhaler in one hand and her composition notebook in the other. And she was standing there in the way she had stood through every difficult thing since her mother died, with her feet planted and her shoulders straight and her eyes doing the quiet work of taking everything in. She looked at Paige, she looked at her father, she said, "He told the front desk you kidnapped her." Malcolm absorbed that. "Show me your notebook," he said. She held it out. He read what she'd written, the camera cycle, the cart switch, the fragrance memo, and he looked at his daughter, and he thought about all the things she had absorbed without being taught, all the things she had catalogued out of love and attention, and the particular intelligence of a child who had decided the world was worth understanding. "Good," he said. "You did good." Then Paige made a sound, a compressed, choked sound, and pressed her hand to her chest. Malcolm turned. Paige's breathing had gone wrong again. The flower staging room had been full of fragrance, and the linen chute had been worse, and now whatever had been building in her respiratory system was arriving all at once. Her lips were slightly pale. Her inhale was audible. "I don't have," she started. Lila held out the spare inhaler before Paige could finish the sentence. Paige looked at it. She looked at Lila. She looked at the inhaler, a child's medication, small and worn, with a sticker of a cartoon star on the cap that was half peeled from years of handling. "It's albuterol," Lila said. "Same dose as most rescue inhalers. It'll work." She said it the way 11-year-olds say things they've learned from necessity, not as performance but as plain fact. Paige took the inhaler. She used it. She breathed. They stood in the south corridor for 30 seconds and nobody said anything. Then Malcolm's phone buzzed again. It was Amara. The text said, "Malcolm, call me. I need to see the maintenance log for Cart 7. He read it twice. He thought about what it meant that Amara was asking for the cart log now, an hour after she had handed his badge to Conrad Voss in a plastic sleeve. He thought about what had shifted in the 40 minutes since then. He called her. She picked up on the first ring. "Tell me where you are," she said. "Tell me why you need the cart log," he said. A pause. A short pause, but a real one. "Because I pulled the full maintenance records and there are 2 Cart 7 entries for the same day. One is yours, one is signed by Conrad, and the signature doesn't match his file signature. And the service camera on the second floor junction, the one that shows you with the cart, only shows you with Cart 7 for 6 seconds. That's not enough time to have been in the suite." Malcolm said nothing. "The bracelet," Amara said. If someone switched the cart before the camera window, then whatever was in the cart was already planted, and you were just the camera gap, Malcolm said. 90 seconds every 6 minutes. Another pause. How do you know that? My daughter told me. He heard Amara breathing. Where are you? She said again, and this time the question had a different register. South corridor, lower basement. I have Paige Bell with me. She is safe. She has documentation of the senator's campaign finance irregularities on a USB drive. Conrad Voss restrained her and placed her in a laundry cart. He is currently looking for both of us. The silence on Amara's end lasted 4 full seconds. I'm pulling the basement cameras to my terminal right now, she said. Don't go anywhere. Conrad controls the gala ballroom, Malcolm said. Can you get into the AV system? What do you need? A 60-second window and a display screen. He heard her moving. He heard the click of a keyboard. I can give you the secondary screen, she said, the one above the bar. It's on a separate input from the main stage. That's enough, Malcolm. She stopped. Started again. I should have. Not now, he said. Later. He ended the call. He looked at Paige. He looked at Lila. He thought about every planted detail, the card exchange, the camera gap, the fragrance memo, the dry ice container somewhere in this building, with $2 million in diamonds sitting inside it. He thought about Conrad Voss telling the front desk that Malcolm Hayes had kidnapped the senator's daughter. He thought about what happens when a man who has done nothing wrong spends all his energy proving it rather than doing what needs to be done. He reached into his jacket pocket and found the utility knife and put it back on his belt. Then he picked up Lila's composition notebook and the USB drive that Paige had pressed into his hand 30 seconds earlier, because she had decided something and had acted on it without announcing the decision. There's a service entrance to the ballroom from the north kitchen corridor, he said. It goes past the AV station. I know, Paige said. He looked at her. I've been in this hotel 3 times this year, she said. Campaign events. I know every room my father uses. They went. The north kitchen corridor was active. Line cooks moving. The heat and noise of dinner service pushing through the swing doors every time they opened. Malcolm moved them along the wall, behind the equipment carts and the staging stations, keeping Paige between himself and Lila, keeping his pace even and his posture unremarkable. He had spent 4 years being unremarkable in this building. He knew how to do it. The AV station was a booth recessed into the north wall of the ballroom, accessible from the kitchen corridor by a pass-through designed for cable management. The AV technician was a young man named Derek, who had been running events at the Grand Meredith for 2 years, and who, when Malcolm appeared in his booth with a teenage girl in a ruined dress and an 11-year-old with an inhaler, looked at them with the expression of someone trying to decide very quickly which version of this situation he was in. Malcolm put the USB drive on the desk. Secondary display, he said, above the bar. Amara Chen has already opened the input. I need you to run this drive to that screen. Derek looked at the drive. He looked at Malcolm. He looked at the ballroom through the glass, where Senator Richard Bell was standing at the podium doing what Senator Richard Bell did, which was talk about children and families and the kind of future we owe the next generation. Derek looked at Paige Bell. His expression changed. How long do you need? He said. 2 minutes, Malcolm said. Derek took the drive. In the ballroom, the senator was reaching his conclusion. He had a good conclusion. His speechwriter was excellent, and the room was with him. 700 people who had each paid at least $3,000 to sit in this room were listening to a man describe the values he intended to carry into the governor's office. And the room believed him because he was good at being believed. Evelyn Bell was seated at the head table. She was watching her husband the way people watch something they have invested in, something that must perform correctly, with the cool and evaluating eye of someone monitoring an asset. She was not watching the secondary screen above the bar. Nobody was until it turned on. The screen was normally used for drink menus and event scheduling. What it showed now was a spreadsheet, a dense, column-formatted spreadsheet of donor records and fund transfers, and in the leftmost column were dates, and in the rightmost column were dollar amounts, and in the center were account numbers routed through an organization called the Children's Future Trust. Below the spreadsheet, filling the lower third of the screen, was a video. It was phone footage, taken from a difficult angle. from somewhere low, through a gap, with the particular compression artifacts of a device recording under pressure. In the video, Conrad Voss was pressing a strip tape across the mouth of a girl in a pale blue dress, who was saying something that the audio compression had degraded but whose body language was absolutely clear. The senator saw it before most of the room did. He saw it because the screen was directly in his sight line, and because the human eye is drawn to motion. And the motion of Conrad Voss pressing tape over a teenager's mouth was a very specific kind of motion. He stopped speaking. The room turned. 700 people looked at the screen above the bar, and then they looked at the north side of the ballroom, where a girl in a ruined blue dress was standing in the corridor entrance with a black man who worked at this hotel, and an 11-year-old holding an inhaler, and it took the room approximately 4 seconds to understand what it was seeing. Senator Bell said, "Paige." He said it as a father. He had the voice for it. Warm, concerned, reaching. He stepped forward from the podium with his arms beginning to open. Paige Bell said, "Don't." One word. She said it across 40 feet of ballroom floor, without a microphone, without a raised voice, in the tone of someone who has practiced this sentence in her head for weeks and is now saying it for the last time. The senator's arms stopped. The room was very quiet. Malcolm walked to the nearest table and picked up a water glass and held it out to Paige, and she took it without looking at him because she was still looking at her father, and the small transaction of the glass and the water was so ordinary in the middle of everything else that it was the thing several people remembered afterward. Not the spreadsheet, not the video, but the man who had just been accused of kidnapping, handing a glass of water to the girl he was supposed to have taken. Conrad Voss appeared at the south entrance. He had his hand at his jacket. He had the posture of someone calculating exits. He looked at the screen. He looked at Malcolm. He looked at Paige. The calculation ran out. From the east side of the ballroom, 2 men in plainclothes who had been seated at a table near the press section stood up. They were not journalists. They had been seated near the press section because press sections are good places to watch from, and they had been watching for an hour since receiving a call that afternoon about a USB drive and a teenager and a campaign finance irregularity that someone had decided needed an audience before it needed an arrest. Paige had called them 6 days ago. She had called the right number and left the right message, and been told to be at the hotel tonight with the documentation, and she had tried, and Conrad Voss had intercepted her in the hallway, and the 2 men at the press table had spent the last hour watching for a signal that had not come. They had not expected the signal to be a hotel laundry supervisor and a screen above the bar. Conrad Voss did not run. There was nowhere to run to, and he knew it. And whatever else Conrad Voss was, he was not a man who wasted energy on gestures. He put his hands on the table in front of him and waited. The senator looked at his daughter. Paige Bell looked at her father for a long moment, at the man who had built a career on protecting families while dismantling his own, who had given speeches about children's futures while using a children's charity as a financial instrument, who had sent Conrad Voss to put tape over the mouth of his 16-year-old daughter rather than have an honest conversation with her about what she had found. She did not say anything to him. She turned and walked back through the corridor entrance, and Malcolm and Lila followed her, and the ballroom door closed behind them. In the kitchen corridor, the line cooks had stopped moving. Everyone had heard something, or enough of something, and the staff of the Grand Meredith Hotel were doing what staff of any large institution does in a moment of crisis, standing in the specific stillness of people who are waiting to understand what the new parameters are. Derek from the AV station was standing in the corridor. He held out the USB drive. Malcolm took it. "Evidence," Derek said. "Yes, I backed it up to the hotel's secure server before I ran it." Derek looked at the drive in Malcolm's hand. "Just so you know, there's a copy." Malcolm looked at him. Derek had a young man's face and the careful eyes of someone who had grown up watching things that weren't meant to be seen and had learned early that sometimes what you did with what you saw mattered more than the seeing itself. "Thank you," Malcolm said. Derek nodded and went back to his booth. The investigation that followed took 3 months. The federal indictment of Senator Richard Bell and his chief of security, Conrad Voss, was 47 pages long, 17 counts of campaign finance fraud, 3 of obstruction, and 1 of conspiracy relating to the detention of a minor. Evelyn Bell was named as a cooperating witness in exchange for a reduced role in the proceedings. She had not known about Paige until after the cart had been arranged, but she had known about the children's future trust, and the line between not knowing and choosing not to know had been erased by 3 text messages her attorneys could not make disappear. The bracelet was found in the flower refrigeration unit, in a small dry ice container behind the white hydrangeas, exactly where Malcolm had said it would be. Amara Chen presented the full maintenance logs to the federal investigators herself. She presented them in person at a conference table, with the original documents and the discrepancy notations she had made the night of the gala, and she did not minimize her earlier role in the evening. She had sacrificed a man to protect a contract. She said so in plain language and did not dress it differently. She came to Malcolm's apartment 3 weeks later. He answered the door in a paint-spattered shirt because he and Lila had been repainting the hallway, which was something they had been meaning to do for 2 years and had finally started. Amara stood in the doorway. She said, "I have a position. Operations Safety Manager. It's a different role than what you had. More authority. Better compensation. No night shifts unless you choose them." Malcolm leaned against the doorframe. "You came here to tell me that in person," he said. "I came here to tell you I'm sorry," Amara said. "In person. The job is separate. You can have it or not have it." He looked at her. She met his eyes and did not look away. "I'll think about it," he said. She nodded. She left. He went back to painting the hallway. Paige established the Yvonne Hayes Fund for Children with Chronic Illness 4 months after the gala. It operated out of a small office in the city and provided medication subsidies and specialist referrals for children whose families couldn't afford the gap between what insurance covered and what breathing required. The name had been her idea. She had found it in a news article about Malcolm that mentioned his wife, and she had called him to ask permission, and he had stood in the kitchen for a long moment before he said yes. The fund's first recipient was a 7-year-old boy in the same school district as Lila. Lila knew about the fund before Malcolm told her, because Lila knew about most things before they were explained to her. She had looked it up, read the description, and come to her father at dinner with her composition notebook open to a page where she had written the name at the top in careful letters. "Yvonne Hayes Fund," she said. "Paige named it after Mom." "Yes," Malcolm said. Lila looked at the notebook. She looked at her father. "Is that okay?" she said. "Yes," he said again. She closed the notebook. They ate dinner. Later, in the school parking lot, after Lila had finished telling him that she wasn't afraid of powerful people anymore. Not the way she had been, not the way she had held her inhaler with both hands, and watched her father cross the lobby. She had looked at him and said, "I saw their faces when the screen came on. They weren't sure what to do." "No," Malcolm said. "Conrad, especially." She was quiet for a moment. He looked like he'd forgotten something could surprise him. Malcolm started the car. "People like that," he said. "They spend a long time being the surprise. It's easy to forget the world can return the favor." Lila looked out the window at the parking lot, at the school building, at the November sky doing what November skies do, going gray early, going cold, preparing for the long accounting of winter. "The cart," she said, "with the Morse code. Did you know it was going to matter when you heard it?" "No," he said. "But you went anyway." "Yes." She nodded, as if this confirmed something she had been working out. "That's the thing," she said. "You went to get my medicine. That's why you were there. You weren't trying to be in the right place. You just were." Malcolm pulled out of the parking lot and into the street. "Your mother used to say," he said, "that the most important things you ever do, you do sideways. You're not going toward them. You're going somewhere else and they're there. And you make a choice, and that's the whole thing." Lila thought about that. She was right, she said. He didn't find the bracelet. That was Amara and the investigators and the dry ice container behind the white hydrangeas. He didn't build the case. That was Paige, 6 days of careful documentation and a USB drive in a hidden pocket and a phone call to the right number. He didn't give the speech or hold the press conference or write the 47-page indictment. What he did was hear a sound in a corridor where someone had decided no one would hear anything, and go toward it, and not stop when stopping would have been easier. That is not a small thing. It is also not a grand thing. It is the thing that was needed, done by the person who was there, at the cost of believing that a person who has been treated as nothing still carries the authority to act. Power makes a particular mistake, over and over, across years and institutions and all the rooms where authority decides who matters. It mistakes the willingness to absorb humiliation for the absence of capability. It looks at a man who does not argue back and concludes that he cannot. What it cannot account for is the man who chooses not to argue, because he is saving his voice for when it matters, who stands in a lit corridor with his badge already gone, and his daughter watching and his hands quiet at his sides, and who is already thinking about what comes next, because some people have been taught by necessity to think that way, and necessity is a better teacher than power has ever understood. The bracelet was worth $2 million. Malcolm Hayes never touched it. What he found in that basement, in that cart, was worth considerably more. A 16-year-old girl who had not yet been broken, who had learned Morse code from a library book in the weeks she'd been planning her escape, who had sewn a pocket into the neckline of a dress specifically to hide a thumb drive, who had made a phone call to the right number 6 days before a gala and trusted that the world would meet her halfway. It did, not in the way she'd planned, not through the door she'd chosen, through a laundry corridor, in the dark, with a man who had gone to get his daughter's medicine and heard something he was not meant to hear and did not walk past it. That is how it went. That is how most of the important things go. Not announced, not arranged, simply present in the hands of whoever showed up.